Welcome to the Office Hour podcast, where we discuss science, AI, and learning tools for everyday life. I'm your host, Dr. Elle Wang. Our guest today is Dr. Barbara Oakley, a renowned educator, best-selling author, and a pioneer in the field of learning and engineering education. She is a professor of engineering at Oakland University and teaches one of the world's most popular MOOCs, Learning How to Learn, which has enrolled nearly 4 million students worldwide. Her research spans the intersection of neuroscience and social behavior, with work published in outlets like the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. From her fascinating early career as a linguist, an Army signal officer, to her work as a Russian translator in the Bering Sea, and her time spent at the South Pole, Barbara has continually reinvented herself and her approach to learning. She is an advocate for breaking down complex ideas into approachable steps, making her a leading voice in educational innovation. And today, it's my great honor to have Dr. Oakley to join the show. Welcome.
It's such an honor to be here, Elle, and we're old friends, so it's kind of nice just to be able to talk.
You know what? I have to tell you, the moment I was having a starstruck moment with you. So it was in 2018 in Madrid at the Learning with the MOOCs conference. And I remember that I was having jet lag and I was having some difficulty adjusting to the Spain eating schedule. But like they have lunch at 4 p.m., dinner at 10 p.m. So I found myself not really being able to focus on the talks until you came up on stage, literally, and you just changed the whole dynamic. And I was like, wow, this professor is a superstar. And I love her slides. I love the way she talks. And I can even remember what she was talking about until today, literally. I remember you're talking about how one should be a great teacher. And you talked about, sometimes you do need to be almost like a Hollywood actor to have that kind of presence, but also you need to have patience and genuine interest to students. And you said one line, do not forget forever, which is, as a teacher, you should not be just getting on a stage and try to win it. And that just stayed with me forever. So that was the moment that afterwards we met in person for the first time. And I was forever grateful.
It's so funny because our job as teachers, it makes me laugh sometimes because I was invited to speak at Harvard and I was like this total nervous wreck because, it's like Harvard. And I walked in the room and I was even more nervous because it was packed with standing room only. And I thought, why are there so many people here? But it turns out that our one little Learning How to Learn course, made for next to nothing, mostly in my basement, had on the order of the same number of students as all of Harvard's massive open online courses and online courses put together, made for millions of dollars with hundreds of people. I think the moral of the story kind of arises from the comments of several of the professors from Harvard. And they were like, there's a reason that you are so popular. You just make it so easy for your learners. And I just thought, isn't that our job as teachers, is to convey the ideas in a simpler, more like elevator brief version of what the key points are that you're trying to convey. And making it is really hard. And studies have shown that the harder it is, the more people shy away from it. But if we can make it easier by simplifying the essential contents of what we're trying to convey, makes an enormous difference for learners. So I guess the trick is just that I have to make it really simple for me to understand. And so I generally find if it works for me, people in general can enjoy and understand what is being conveyed.
Wow, thank you for sharing that anecdote. And I cannot agree more on the point that as teachers, we should make materials easier to understand. And did I get it right that some of the professors were saying something like I feel like they're kind of giving out a sense that making something easy to understand is a simple task? Or to me, that's an extraordinarily difficult task. It may sound simple and easy for people to digest, but the process and thinking and preparation to make this process effortless usually takes a gigantic amount of work and energy.
You are so right. Sometimes it's a little difficult because you can, for example, for me, it takes a lot of time and careful thinking to devise just the right visual metaphor that can quickly convey the deeper idea you're trying to get at. And what people can walk away from a talk like that and say, man, this is just so easy. It's just so simple that anybody can do it, and anybody can do it after they've seen how it's made easy. But then if you've done your job right, you've actually made yourself seem superfluous. So it's just one of those conundrums of great teaching. If you walk away and they think it's super easy, they already knew it anyway, you've done everything right.
Absolutely. So here I have to mention that I truly have read your books, and then a lot of techniques I still use today, including, well, everybody now knows the Pomodoro technique, and really take advantage of the diffuse mode of your brain after your focused session. So I have taken extensive notes on that book, and I really enjoyed reading the book because you have great storytelling technique as well. And the stories about famous scientists, professionals, and it really helped me find the learning journey to be as if I was reading a novel, and at the same time, I can put the book down and think about it, try an experiment. And this is how unconsciously changed the way I absorb new content from that moment on. And that was already, I have to admit, like, I read your book after we met the first time in person. So it probably was not when the book was first, out. So I do encourage our listeners, if you have not read Dr. Oakley's books, you really have to try it. And it's really a page turner. You will not regret it. So since we're having this precious time to talk in person again, I have always been really curious about your background. I know you must have delivered a story a million times in your keynotes and workshops, but it's just your background is super fascinating. Become a Russian translator for the army, and then you met your husband in Antarctica, of all the places in the world. So first question, you studied Russian. Did you have a choice of picking a language, or how did you end up being a Russian translator?
That's a good question, but I want to back up for just a second to allude to something you said earlier. You said, I've always been really curious. And I think long before I met you and before you read my books and so forth, you were curious. And I think that's where learning it helps your own learning if you are curious about things. And you can't be curious about everything. I mean, everybody has taken super boring classes that they did not want to take. But as it turns out, curiosity can elicit dopamine in the brain that kind of hangs around. And without dopamine, you can't learn anything. Mice that have their little dopamine systems inactivated cannot learn anything new. So a good thing that you can do now is you can go to ChatGPT or other engines like Claude or Gemini or so forth. And if you're super bored with something and you really don't want to learn it, tell it a little bit about your own background and ask it to help you get more curious about this topic. And it's amazing how it can really be helpful. That's one of the reasons I love generative AI. But to go back, so
I'm sorry to interrupt here.
sure.
You just shared something really helpful here. On my note, I was going to ask you about using AI later on, but you just shared a prompting technique right there. You just explained that curiosity is really helpful, even though we can't be curious all the time. Because curiosity does give us dopamine that helps us learn. It will eventually wane, and you can't rely on it forever. And one opportunity here at today's age with generative AI is we can simply ask ChatGPT or Claude, given the AI our context, what we're doing, or some challenges, please help me drive my curiosity, or use something simple like that. So you are giving yourself a sort of learning companion and motivator when you choose to do so. And I think it's really important also you mentioned that you have to give ChatGPT the context rather than just say, do something for me, because it does not have infinite memory to the best of my knowledge so far. And so I just wanted to mention that so our listeners can probably try right away, pause here and describe your context and why you are getting less curious or a little bit bored about certain learning subject. And you can try to ask ChatGPT to give you some solutions, suggestions to help you boost your curiosity. All right, please go ahead.
Exactly.
Russian translator.
Okay, okay. So I think why did I choose Russian? Well, I wanted something different than English, pretty different, but I was a bit intimidated by Chinese because it's a super important language. But at the same time, I kind of knew that I could study it for a decade and I would still be struggling to some extent. And I thought Russian is at least close enough that I could maybe master it, but, not be kind of still groping my way forward in a decade. But I think more importantly was for 3 months before we moved, when I was about 16 years old, at this high school, for whatever reason, they happened to have Russian instruction. So I took an hour a day during the school day from their Russian teacher. And I think she really just got me motivated, got me curious, got me excited about the language. And that early little bit of excitement meant that when it came time, I really could have chosen any language I wanted to study. But it was like, I'll pick Russian because, I already had enthusiasm for it because of that teacher. So that's why I picked it more or less. And now I wish I had picked Spanish because our little granddaughter is growing up
Oh,
trilingual, but her daddy is from Chile. And so she bounces. She's almost 2 years old and she laughs at me when she hears me speaking Spanish or trying to speak Spanish because she knows I don't have the right accent and she just finds it hilarious.
wow, that's just so fascinating how a 2-year-old is able to master multiple languages at a pretty high level from what you've described. And also, like, human brain is remarkable, starting at a very young age.
Yeah.
So it seems that the reason you chose Russian partly was because it's at the so-called necessary challenging level. So it's different enough from your mother tongue, but it's not like something you feel like you lack confidence in mastering in a reasonable amount of time. Plus, you have encountered a teacher who's giving you some encouragement. And then you embarked on this Russian translator career for a while. And then you were working on a trawler, right? So I don't think many people know what a trawler is. Do you mind explaining a little bit?
So in the late 1970s, early 80s. One country, previously it had been that countries who bordered the sea generally considered the boundary of the country to be about 3 miles away from shore. But suddenly, one country expanded their boundary to 200 miles offshore, and then pretty much the world followed suit. So in the US, suddenly we expanded our maritime boundaries to 200 miles offshore. And this meant that all the foreign trawlers or, fish catching ships suddenly couldn't fish waters that they had previously fished in for decades. And that 200-mile limit off sea, there's a lot of what they call cheap pelagic fish. That's like midwater fish that runs in big, schools of fish, like hake is a big one, pollock is another. And the thing is, so I'm getting into like the nitty gritty details. So let's see if I can make it really fast. If you have a little boat, by the time it goes in and out, to, go off 200 miles offshore, it's wasting all this fuel. So you need a big catcher boat that can haul in a bunch of fish and process it. So it's really a factory, almost a factory boat itself. But the Americans didn't have such trawlers, but the Russians did. So they combined forces in a joint company where the Americans would catch the fish, which was perfectly legal, and then pass it off at sea to the Soviets to process. But they needed an American on board those Soviet trawlers to translate, to facilitate everything. So they would radio me and say, let's see, we need you to blank, 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 slow the boat down. And why the heck are you in the wrong position with the waves? And then I would translate that into nicer terminology in Russian and say, please turn the boat around, Yuri. So I worked to facilitate between the Russians and the Americans on board. And I still remember one time, let me put it this way. The two factions generally hated one another because, it's like the filthy communists and then it's the filthy capitalists. And so I said, well, let's have a party and have them like meet with one another. And it's harder to hate somebody when you meet them. So we organized a party, and the Americans came on board. By that time, they'd been able to get a lot of alcohol. And so they dropped a case of vodka off on the bridge, and we all went down and we opened the big officer's mess. And there was all this communist propaganda on the pamphlets and so forth. And so, I introduced the American captain to the Soviet captain, and the Soviet captain is like, welcome to our Soviet socialist vessel. And, hands him these brochures. And the American is like, hey, you want to do some cocaine? And it was so funny, how the two different worlds interacting. But about 2 a.m, there was suddenly this gigantic clunk, and the whole boat shook. We're 150 miles out at sea. There is no way that there should be this big clunk. And the lights dimmed, the power was lost. Captain goes bolting up to the bridge, and I go bolting up after him. And I mentioned that they dropped a case of vodka off on the bridge. Well, the bridge crew drank it all. They got drunk and they backed the trawler up into an American boat that was a mile away. And all the Americans started laughing. They're like, told you, Kenny, you shouldn't have parked your ship so close. So it was but they did get to be friendlier and worked together more easily after that party.
Oh, so you were pretty much a diplomat yourself at that time. And just all sound like almost a really nice movie script. It's like, I would watch a movie. And I think you did write a book about it, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was called A Hair of the Dog. It was, that's alluding to that old expression, have a hair of the dog that bit you, which is drink alcohol in the morning and that will make your hangover from the night before feel better. It was a very interesting experience, but I also began to realize from that experience how easy it can be to isolate a population so that they will believe the most unusual things that may be sometimes counter to reality. So that led to my work in pathologies of altruism, which is, good intentions that, as they say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So I did an edited book called Pathological Altruism and did a paper on altruism bias for the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So that was all interesting and, by the by, helpful when it comes to the field of education, because so often what is done in education is done with good intentions, but can be very problematic in its outcomes.
So, by the way, to the listeners, I will put the link to the books and papers mentioned in our show notes. So make sure you check them out. And I was just about to ask, how does these experiences, I mean, it sounds really unusual and you perhaps had a lot of fun, but I think it's, living in harsh situations, be it in the Bering Sea or Antarctica later on. How does those experiences influence your later choice of career direction, or how does those experiences change you personally? It's a big question.
That's a good question. One thing it's a little odd, but people will sometimes say to me, "Oh, we're not sure this hotel is good enough for you," or whatever. And I'm just like, man, as long as the floor is not moving back and forth so the sewer backs up on the toilet, I am a happy camper. When you've had some difficulty, and I can't even say that I compare with what many people have experienced. But if you experience at least a little hardship, it makes you appreciate, that generally for us as citizens, we have it pretty good. So I try not to complain over much about things that are going on, unless it deals with competently doing your job. And then competence, I think, is a really important thing. So I do tend to squawk if I'm using an app or something of that nature that doesn't work properly. But it was really, it sounds now as if I was heading for a career in education, but I am truly the accidental educator. I think just being open to new adventures and new perspectives. And I was, the most alien thing I could possibly have imagined to my natural underlying personality is to become an engineer. So, of course, that's what I ultimately began to study because it was a challenge. And then I kind of kept going. And I worked in the real world, so it wasn't just this academic silo, and then all of a sudden I'm a professor. I've worked professionally as an electrical engineer, and of course all these other jobs, radio operator, signal corps officer, and so forth. But then the bottom line is that they offered me a job when I was getting my Ph.D. at Oakland University. And I applied for it. They encouraged me to apply to become a professor. And then suddenly I was appointed as a professor. I didn't know anything about teaching. And And that was a lucky thing because it made me kind of go back to first principles myself. And what I often find when I look at education and what is going on in that world, people don't go to first principles themselves. They just take for granted, hey, what Dewey said over a century ago with complete lack of information about what we now know about how the brain works. What he said is right, and we're going to base everything off of his approaches and perhaps a few newer people, but still nothing with true research, evidence-based insight into how we learn effectively. So I think it was a lucky thing that I didn't have a background in education, and I'm hoping through my career to help turn the ship of education towards more of an evidence-based, but growing from neuroscience. Just because it's got research that says it works, still you can 0.13% of all educational literature is replicated. That means anybody could, all you have to do is get something published, and it is highly unlikely that people will actually check that what you're asserting in that paper is true. So you get these weird fads like, to learn math, you just have to teach so that children are writing on a vertical surface. I mean, it's kind of not appropriate to have a entire, school of thought that grows out of a very poorly research.
So I really wanted to point out what you just said. You said something that you didn't have an education background, but you were a professor of engineering, right? And this is so rare because I was deep in the learning sciences industry, and I've never heard any professor is not, quote unquote, a professor of education or educational psychology to say something like, I did not have an education background. I think that alone, what you just said, says how humble and modest you were. And you were willing to treat education as a serious discipline, treat teaching as a serious undertaking. I think that's really important. And it is indeed something unfortunately, we don't see a lot of distinguished professors who are really excellent at delivering their research efforts in their respective disciplines. But teaching in itself may take a backstage seat.
Well, along those lines, I have to say, so remember when you had noted that you watched that presentation back in Madrid and it really caught your attention. And so often what I'll find is that if I'm going to go speak somewhere, they're like, and of course, you have to have an active session. So what active sessions are you going to have? It's frustrating because educators have been trained, they have to have active sessions. That's the only way that students learn. And it's not the case at all. If you have really carefully designed materials with motion and that have great visuals and make it simple, people can pay attention for a long time. And that is what gets those initial links of learning into your mind, which you can then consolidate through your own practice. Unfortunately, teachers have been so trained with this idea that active learning is where it's all at, that they even think that if they open their mouths, they are being bad teachers. And so, I mean, it is true that for young children, it can be valuable to have young children getting their hands on things and actively doing it themselves. But for older students, and that includes teenagers, if you're expecting them to figure everything out themselves, you're just going to waste a lot of their time and you're not going to be a very effective teacher. So the change that I see and could be occurring in the field of education, and it's through efforts like your own, that you and I can spread these great ideas that are growing from wonderful research to truly help both teachers and students.
So I'm hearing a couple of really good points that you just said. One is a specific example. Obviously, it's a catchphrase. It's popular to say something like use active learning or problem-based learning. But in reality, these so-called practitioners, be it teachers or parents, they sometimes would just read a headline, a title, and they would just feel like they got it. And they start implementing without really reading the paper itself. Because in most cases, as you just said, those research experiments were conducted in highly controlled lab settings or for a specific small group of students. They may not be replicable for your specific students or for you. So when we look at, even it's some study popularized by the New York Times, it doesn't necessarily mean you should go ahead and just try to copy and claim that you got the panacea. And I think number two is, I think, really important because I work with a lot of the practitioners, also startup companies who are in the edtech space, and they often are not professional researchers. So on one hand, they feel like they can only rely on major media outlet to tell them what kind of studies are significant, which new practices they should adopt. It is still really important for the community to find out a way to help non-professional researchers, practitioners understand how to critically review a paper. And especially now we have ChatGPT, and it's not extremely challenging to create a custom GPT to help you understand the gist of the paper while providing the GPT of your specific context. And I also agree with you that, for example, you just said, it's really popular to say, oh, we need active learning, which is, interactive, student-led discussions, and the traditional ways of having a lecturer delivering something behind the podium is dead. But it may not be true. Highly, personalized, engaging lecture series can be extremely effective. And some students do learn while they sit there in silence sometimes. They think and regurgitate the content, and they need some time to formulate questions and absorb the content. You can't just, keep discussing with your classmates forever. Because I was personally in some courses where maybe 80% of the course session was discussion groups come up with a presentation. I think there was definitely benefits to that style, but even for me, I was kind of hoping that I could have more opportunities to hear the lecturer's experiences, how he or she interpreted a certain concept.
That's so true. And that brings up so many different thoughts. So for one thing, for example, the New York Times did a big article on the Japanese education system and how their integration of active learning methods has resulted in superlative achievements on the part of Japanese students, particularly, for example, in learning math. And not a single mention was made of the copious use of juku, these cram schools, afterwards that allow Japanese students to get a lot of extra practice with math. So it was this very one-dimensional article that didn't acknowledge much broader strands of education being done in Japan, but it reinforced the beliefs of the journalist who wrote that article. So, and of course, the research that was cited makes it sound like, boy, that's the method that was used, but there's not a single mention of something that everyone in Japan knows. So I think it's very important to just recognize that for example, recently there was a science article on active learning in STEM classrooms. There were several of them. And it was active learning is what makes all the difference. But not a single mention was made, for example, in this one paper of how there was private coaching by bots, and that wasn't considered to be instruction. That was considered to be active learning. But it's actually instruction by bots. So getting instruction is really as important as the student being able to practice it. But they didn't count that as getting instruction. That was just a part of active learning, what they called active learning. So it's oftentimes what is termed to be active learning is it changes. It's amorphous thing. I've even seen an individual who wrote a whole book on active learning. And when I pointed out that he never included instruction by the teacher as part of active learning, so he rewrote all the references to active learning in the whole book so that the new edition would include that as the reference. It's a funny thing, but everybody loves active learning, but they just don't acknowledge the fact that while student-directed learning is really important, teacher-directed learning is still important. The teachers matter too.
Absolutely. Since in your teaching style, you always use a lot of analogies. I'm going to try to use analogy here, which I know it's highly not accurate. But first, the context is in a lot of the learning sciences or social sciences, a lot of the concept, such as active learning, they're not really pointing to a single thing, even for the same person. It in itself can be a complex system in itself. And then for those of us who are slightly familiar with complex theory, that usually when scientists talk about complexity, they're usually referring to something like we need to predict earthquake or hurricane. There's so many, hundreds, millions of variables come into play. It's not easy for us to think about the learning context. In a way, for learning to happen or for a certain person to learn better or not, there's also this really complex system. And it's almost never a single factor that is the dominating, deciding factor for the learning outcome.
Mhm.
But somehow, because in reality, I guess, helping a eighth grader learn better, math sounds like such an easier task than predicting hurricane. But in reality, perhaps just because our lack of knowledge, maybe there are also hundreds of millions of variables, right? It could be, biological variables. It could be contextual variables. It could be anything, in tomorrow, yesterday, the whole history of the student. So in that sense, it is kind of like predicting hurricane for a student. So
Yes.
I also think, whenever I say something generative AI or active learning or problem-based learning, I think there are definitely benefits, for sure benefits, drilling into the practices. But we often get down to the past where somehow I can feel like, oh, it sounds so right. I'm already 100% on board. I think
Yeah.
sometimes we just have to be a little bit critical about why we are so much easier at absorbing one, argument concept than the other. It's because our, pre-context, where we live, what kind of information we absorb on a daily basis, we usually don't stop and analyze these kind of things. And as a matter of fact, I think I am guilty of not doing enough reflections of my, learning journeys or career journeys. And I think it's also challenging for maybe, students at a younger age or students as an adult. And I think in itself, we shouldn't trade educational sciences and experiments, even though it's considered sometimes a causal experiment, as if it were physics. Because it was not physics. Even if you used a model, mathematics, perhaps used in economics, which I often see, that this is a causal model, but you just prove something, or not really. You shouldn't use the word prove that worked for that 20 students in that classrooms.
Right.
And I need more evidence before I, as one person, to use it.
There's so much, I think pathological altruism comes into play. You think, this is so obviously true. It is funny because all around the world, I'll ask people, what is the best way to teach students or for students to learn? Is it rereading, underlining, using flashcards or retrieval practice, or is it concept maps? And by and large, everybody is like, they're like knee-jerk concept maps because they've all been trained that concept maps is that's obviously the best. But actually, nobody ever went and researched it until 2012 when Jeff Karpicki and his crew and his colleagues, you know, did a study of those 4 techniques and found that by far retrieval practice is the best. And since that time, hundreds of studies have backed that up. Yet it's like concept maps are this golden thing that everyone still clings to. And it's really quite a shocker that that people are not paying attention, or that schools of education aren't integrating these new approaches. And I think part of it is for so many years, there's been this bias that any kind of remembering or memory or, is rote learning. It's bad. So I still remember one student coming up to me. He'd flunked engineering statistics test that I'd given him. And he says, I just don't understand how I could have flunked this test. And he flaunts it in front of me. He says, I understood it when you said it in class. And the thing is, we've gotten so overboard that conceptual understanding is the only important thing that we ignore the fact that if you can't remember something you understood conceptually, it doesn't matter. You have to have a memory of it. And, emphasizing remembering as well as conceptual understanding provides the balance that students need.
Speaking of rote learning and repetition, I think rote learning and repetition has been dubbed something really evil for a long time, at least in the US. And at a point, I think in my personal experiences, because I have advised some startup founders in the educational technology space, especially in the math learning space. I think some of our listeners are tech founders in a middle school math learning space, which is really the most profitable space. And often I find that parents and teachers sometimes would ask questions about why their kid is not doing really well in math. And usually the developers would have a solution that, okay, let's try to add in some fancy features, be it animated cat face to interact with the kid, or let's try some other A/B testing to change the layout, the UX. And I rarely find that the developers would ask whether the students were given enough time to practice. Like that information was not really baked into the whole system in developing a tool. And sometimes, perhaps, you don't need to invest another $5 million for a new feature. You may want to add a reminder to the student or the parent or the supervisor that perhaps you should ask the student to try a few more times to see whether their understanding gets better. Because as we just said, your 2-year-old grandson can learn 3 different languages and understand connections and even analogies, perhaps. And we have to trust the human brain, to give the human brain some opportunity to become better, to form those links before we declare that, okay, this tool does not work. The student need more help. It could be a safe choice sometimes, or easier choice for the developers, because then they can do something right away with their own product versus getting to know the user better. Which is why I do think on the R&D part, as a funder and producer of a learning tool, we really need to understand, I think, some basic relationships between the learner and the tool, and how does learning happen before we dive into the popular New York Times front page-ish articles and adopt those practices right away. And it does not necessarily mean the practitioners, the funders, need to spend hours of time to read a single paper. It needs to understand what are the deciding factors. What exactly is the context? Is that context similar to yours? Is it worth your time? I think we should ask more of these questions for these developers who make better products.
I have to add, so there's a major learning platform out there, and they're all enamored of generative AI, as almost every learning platform is. but they will not put in simple retrieval practice flashcards. It's like it's so antagonistic to all the learning theories that they've had. So it's like they're trying every which way except the obvious way that is told, that we know from hundreds of research papers is most effective. And that's like Singapore excels because they emphasize the basic concepts, not because they do all the bells and whistles and so forth. They do that subsequently, but they make sure they've got those basic concepts. Simple retrieval practice of facts is fundamentally important. You can't do anything else, kind of without those facts. And people make the mistake of thinking, oh, it's just rote learning of trivial things. But actually, for really advanced graduate level theories, if you know the facts and kind of can play with them in your mind, as Michael Nielsen, the physicist, has shown, you can make super advances in theory because you have them available in your mind and you can play with those ideas. There's a really good retrieval practice flashcard system that uses AI called Recall, and that is worth looking at how simply and elegantly they have integrated retrieval practice. The person who is behind the development, if I do recall, graduated #1 in his medical school class from a very good school by simply using retrieval instead of underlining and rereading and so forth, but retrieving the key ideas. He was reading in books, watching on videos, and so forth.
That's really fascinating. Sometimes, these seemingly simple practice, they're simple, but they're not necessarily super easy because you have to keep doing that. People may feel like it sounds simple. It must not help me enough. It has to be something more complicated. I think people have some kind of assumption about that's preventing some of the learners from trying these practices.
Well, and part of it is it sounds simple, but it is harder to remember key ideas and pull them from your own mind. So people will naturally resort instead to rereading things and underlining because it is easier. It's not so hard and taxing mentally. And they just shy away from that idea of pulling it from their own mind to ensure that they've tested themselves, that they actually truly know the material.
Well, I feel like a lot of things in life and in learning to really become better is really to try the simple but hard things, such as retrieval practice, such as following the age-old wisdom of, do some exercises, sleep early. Things like that sound so simple, everybody knows. But anything that everybody knows has a reason why it stayed as a wisdom. Just like the novels and classics which stayed classics for hundreds of years are definitely reasons. And just because those books may be free online doesn't mean they're not significant. These are just some of the things I feel like I encounter again and again. Thank you so much for inspiring us and illuminating this journey for us. And I think what you just said, I think I wanted to definitely read more about pathological altruism because I have not really read your work on that part. And I think it's a really fascinating topic. I know we don't have a lot of time, and I hope we can invite you back sometime later because there are so many interesting subjects we can talk about. The last question I want to ask is, well, you must have guessed it, the very hyped ChatGPT and generative AI. Because I know you were just on a 4-country tour in Asia, delivering talks and sharing how we can use AI to accelerate learning. And then is it possible for you to use maybe a few minutes to share some of your suggestions on how people can use it? And especially if there's, something people can try right away.
So first off, I just did a course on Coursera with Jules White, the AI expert from Vanderbilt, called Accelerate Your Learning with ChatGPT.
Oh, wonderful. New course.
Yeah. it gives you a lot of ideas. So let me just share a little bit. So, for example, if you have a difficult concept that you're trying to understand, what you want to do is go to ChatGPT, or actually Claude is my personal favorite, despite Claude's little picadillos. It's what you can do is go and ask it for a metaphor that will help you understand that difficult concept better, and tell it a little bit about yourself. So, for example, when I was in Mongolia, Mongolians, the professors there were in the big city of Ulaanbaatar, and they often have challenges because their students are coming right in off the Mongolian steppe. And they, if you're used to a world of yurts and migratory patterns and so forth, you may have little interest in the world of Python programming. So how can you help those students? Ask for a metaphor and scope in Python programming. What's a good metaphor to explain those concepts to a person who has just come off the Mongolian steppe? Claude or ChatGPT will give you some great metaphors with yurts and, what's going on in the world that those students are familiar with. So for you yourself, ask for, you're grappling with some weird concept you're trying to understand. Explain a little about yourself and your interests, then ask for a good metaphor. And it turns out that your links in long-term memory, from the concept you already understand, can help you to bridge into understanding the new concept you're struggling with. You just have to find that thing you actually already know about, so you can bridge from those neural links to the new pattern, more easily. And just asking for a metaphor or an analogy can really help you with that process.
Well, that's wonderful. So when we're encountering a difficult concept to understand, we can ask ChatGPT or Claude to provide analogy that we are familiar with to help us understand it. And again, provide our own context to the AI first. It will generate a lot of really helpful examples. And that's wonderful. Thank you for that suggestion. And we'll make sure to your new course is Accelerating AI on Learning in our show notes.
Accelerate your learning with ChatGPT.
Okay, wonderful. We'll make sure to put a hyperlink to that course in our show notes. So thank you so much for your time, Professor Oakley. This is a terrific office hour that I felt like it was just 2 minutes past. Can't get enough of it. Thank you so much.
It's always so fun speaking with you. So I look forward to our next get together.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much for tuning in today. If you're interested in exploring more of our guests' books, courses, or articles, check out the links in show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen. And don't forget to leave a comment or review. We'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback, and it helps us bring you even better content in the future. See you next time.